They said the bells stopped ringing in 1834, not because there were no hands left to pull the ropes, but because no one wanted to hear what echoed back. That year, the hills of Kentucky swallowed 412 souls. And no one asked why, not in courtrooms, not in churches, not in newspapers. Only silence. A silence so complete it felt like a warning carved into the land itself. But the truth never dies. It waits. And now, nearly 2 centuries later, what they buried beneath hymns and handshakes begins to rise. The name of the place was Pleasant Hill, a Shaker community nestled among the rolling pastures of Mercer County. It was a name that promised peace. But names lie. Names protect. And Pleasant Hill was never a sanctuary. It was a cage built by those who understood one thing: control doesn't need chains. It only needs belief. It began, like many utopias do, with visions and fire. The Second Great Awakening had cracked open the spiritual hunger of a young America, and charismatic leaders emerged from the wilderness promising clarity in a chaotic world. Among them was a man who called himself Elder Samuel Richardson, not a Richardson by birth. That name was taken, acquired, refined, burnished with sermons and soft eyes that could make a child confess or a mother weep. He spoke of simplicity, of divine order, of shedding the ego and embracing divine structure. But Elder Samuel had no interest in simplicity. His doctrine was not born in revelation, it was forged in calculation. And Pleasant Hill would be his masterpiece. When the community was founded in 1807, it was hailed as a model of Shaker virtue. No private property, no marriage, no personal ambition, only the work of God. Men and women lived apart, slept in separate halls, ate at long communal tables beneath portraits of Mother Ann Lee, the supposed female Christ. To outsiders, it was a marvel of order and purity. For those within, it was a slow, exquisite strangulation of the self. You weren't told to forget who you were taught to never ask, and that's the difference between coercion and erasure. The former breaks you, the latter rewrites you. From the start, Elder Samuel surrounded himself with kin, or those he remade as kin. Sister Martha, his so-called spiritual companion, was presented as a paragon of celibacy. But behind closed doors, their union was flesh and strategy. Together they built a family within the family, a bloodline of watchers, enforcers, manipulators disguised as nurturers. Their children were assigned roles that mimicked service, but in truth they formed a surveillance lattice more complete than any prison. Brother Ezekiel managed the farms, not to grow food, but to measure compliance. Sister Rebecca ran the dormitories like a psychologist with no name for her science, and Caleb watched. Every door, every glance, every whisper. This was no cult in the vulgar sense. There were no poisoned chalices, no wild-eyed prophecies. There was only the cold precision of systemic obedience. New converts arrived with trembling hope, broken widows, destitute farmers, young women shamed by their families. All of them were welcomed with smiles that never touched the eyes, and all of them were told the same thing: to find God, you must forget yourself. Within 6 months they did. Names changed, language softened, individuality was not punished, it was starved. Your doubts were interpreted as impurities. Your silence was read as progress. And once you crossed that threshold, you no longer belonged to yourself. The records show they had over 400 members at their peak, the state records, the ones that still refused to admit what followed, but the math was always off. Receipts for food didn't match the number of mouths. Visitors noted missing faces, and those who left the community, the very few who did, never spoke again. Some claimed they had been healed, others simply refused to speak at all, like something in them had been removed alongside their faith. The local sheriff called it a place of higher order. The governor called it a miracle of the frontier. No one asked where the bodies went. You want to know what happened, don't you? You want to hear the truth. But I'll warn you now, this is not just a tale of cultish cruelty or religious extremism. That would be too easy. No, what happened at Pleasant Hill was something older, a kind of knowledge that exists beneath theology, a manipulation so refined it leaves no fingerprints. And the people who orchestrated it understood one thing above all else. If you can control a man's belief, you can erase his soul without ever touching his body. Pleasant Hill wasn't just a Shaker community, it was an experiment, an altar built to test how far faith can be weaponized before it fractures reality. And it worked. They vanished, yes, 412 souls, over 37 years, not in a single night, but piece by piece, like a slow ritual where no one remembers when the blood was first drawn. But before we go further down this road, I need you to choose. This knowledge is not safe. You won't hear it in school books or documentaries. It is forbidden for a reason. Because once you see how the world truly works, once you see who pulls the strings, there's no going back. If you're ready, type in the comments, I step beyond the veil. Say it twice. Not for me, for you. It marks your choice, to see and to be seen. Now brace your self. What comes next is darker than you've been told. And it's still happening. Because what started in the hills of Kentucky didn't end there. When Brother Elias Kendrick arrived at Pleasant Hill in the spring of 1813, he carried more than just his carpenter's tools. He carried questions. That alone made him dangerous. He was a former Quaker, disillusioned after watching his own community fracture over slavery and silence. He came searching for a purer faith, something unshakable. What he found instead was a machine polished to perfection, one that turned spiritual hunger into submission. The Richardsons welcomed him with the usual hospitality, a prepared bed, a warm meal, a week of silent reflection under Sister Rebecca's supervision. But by day 4, Elias noticed something odd. No one ever laughed. Not a single genuine smile, not a whispered joke behind the barn, not even among the children. It was a community scrubbed clean of joy. And that terrified him more than anything. He'd been assigned to the furniture shop under Brother Jeremiah's quiet gaze. The work was rigorous, precise, and strangely secretive. Elias was not permitted to speak unless spoken to. Each tool was catalogued, each break was timed. But what disturbed him most wasn't the discipline, it was the whispers. Hushed conversations in corners that ended the moment he entered. Ledger books that were locked away, even though they contained nothing but simple numbers, or so it seemed. After hours, Elias began writing in a hidden notebook beneath his cot. He sketched floor plans, recorded faces, logged anomalies. He had no plan, only instinct. A deep ancestral warning that something was terribly wrong here. It didn't take long for the family to notice. They always noticed. One morning, after a routine inspection of his workshop bench, Brother Caleb pulled him aside with a fatherly smile that chilled Elias more than any reprimand. "We see you," he said, not as a threat, but as a declaration. "And we love you enough to help you see yourself." What followed was 5 days in meditative confinement, a wooden cell beside the granary, where Elder Samuel personally visited him each evening to deliver sermons about spiritual correction. No violence, no yelling, just scripture, repetition, and the soft click of a locked door. When Elias returned, he was quieter. He burned his notebook in the communal oven. He avoided eye contact, but his eyes didn't forget. They saw the patterns. They saw how dissent was processed, like an infection. And that knowledge, though buried, remained alive inside him like a ticking clock. Over the years, Elias became a loyal worker, so loyal, in fact, that he was eventually entrusted with overseeing apprentices. That's when the second notebook began. Hidden beneath a loose stone in the north barn, it held names, dates, suspicions, a secret record of disappearances, because the numbers didn't lie, but the ledgers did. Every year, 1 or 2 members simply vanished. Sometimes they were said to have moved on, called to serve elsewhere. Other times it was illness, or a divine calling to silence. But there were no farewells, no letters home, no belongings left behind. And Elias noticed that every disappearance followed the same pattern. Private doubts expressed in confidence to a Richardson, followed by increased work detail, public repentance, and finally, absence. Not a single case deviated. It was a purge masquerading as providence. He watched as Sister Abigail, a weaver from Lexington, disappeared after asking if she could visit her dying mother. He watched as Brother Stephen, a war veteran turned herbalist, vanished after criticizing the bland, identical meals prepared by Sister Hannah, and he watched, helpless, as young Sister Naomi, barely 17, was removed after speaking to a visiting Methodist minister without permission. Each time, the memory of the missing was erased with eerie efficiency. Dormitories reassigned, names struck from chore rotations, records rewritten. And each time, Elder Samuel preached a sermon about the sin of selfishness, how God removes those who place their personal desires above divine unity. In 1819, Elias made a mistake. He confided in Sister Mary Caldwell, the same girl who had once cleaned Brother Thomas Whitman's room. He told her about the notebook, about the pattern. He even showed her a few pages. She wept, not from fear, but from relief. She had seen the same pattern, had counted the bodies in her own way, through laundry loads and missing linens. They agreed to meet once a week, secretly to compile their records, 2 watchers in the heart of the machine. But the machine was always listening. Sister Mary was summoned to private prayer with Sister Rebecca the following week. She returned pale, eyes hollowed. When Elias asked if she remembered their conversation, she simply said, "There was no conversation. You must be mistaken." And then she avoided him entirely, at meals, in worship, even in passing on the paths between buildings. Whatever had been broken inside her, it was irreversible. Elias knew he'd been compromised, so he ran. In the early hours of a fog-choked morning, he crept from the carpenter's hall with only a satchel and his second notebook. He avoided the main paths, moving through fields and orchards, listening for Caleb's dogs. He made it nearly a mile before he heard the bell, not the morning bell, not the worship call. This was different, urgent, panicked. It meant one thing: a soul had fled. Within minutes, the fields behind him echoed with shouting, footsteps, barking. But Elias did not stop. He reached the edge of the property by sunrise, bloodied and breathless, collapsing on the road where a passing farmer found him near death. He survived, barely. His story, however, did not. Local authorities interviewed him once, then twice, but when Sheriff Morrison arrived, the same Morrison who had received years of donations from the Richardsons, the tone shifted. Elias was labeled unstable, a religious hysteric. His notebook was confiscated for review, and he was escorted to the outskirts of the county with the warning to never return. He didn't. He died 10 years later in Ohio, his mind fractured but his memories intact. His story, dismissed, mocked, buried. But that second notebook, it was never found. And some say, it still exists. They say secrets rot the bones of a place, that some buildings breathe with the weight of what they've witnessed. Pleasant Hill, despite its pristine facades and whitewashed fences, was a place where the very walls remembered. And if you stood long enough in the corridors after nightfall, you could feel it. Not just silence, but suppression. In the decades that followed Elias Kendrick's escape, Pleasant Hill's reputation paradoxically flourished. Religious reformers visited and praised its moral order. State officials toured the workshops and marveled at the industry. Donations poured in, and yet locals whispered of strange lights in the woods, of wagons leaving in the dead of night, of children born and then never seen again. The surrounding towns began to learn, ask too many questions, and Pleasant Hill goes quiet, but it never forgets. By 1821, the Richardson family had entered its second phase of dominance. Samuel grew frail but more revered. His sermons, now delivered from a seated chair in the central hall, took on an almost mythic quality. He spoke less of Shaker doctrine and more of divine hierarchy. Order is salvation, he often said, and questioning is the serpent's whisper. Martha Richardson had become the day-to-day governor, though she maintained her humble title of sister. But behind closed doors she was referred to as the Mother of Obedience, a name whispered with a reverence that bordered on fear. It was during this time that a new type of disappearance began, not of adults, but of children. Converts from across Kentucky continued to offer their lives and belongings to Pleasant Hill. Some brought children, Others gave them up directly, convinced by letters that had been circulated quietly throughout church networks. Letters describing Pleasant Hill as Heaven's School, a sanctuary for orphaned or wayward youth. These letters bore Sister Patience as perfect penmanship, and they promised enlightenment, discipline, purity. By 1823, nearly 60 children under the age of 16 lived within the community, but census records from the time, those that remain, only account for 36 by the year's end. Where did the others go? Their names were never recorded. Their possessions, what little they brought, were absorbed into the community. Some say they were adopted out. Others, including a former merchant who once delivered grain to the kitchens, claim to have seen shallow graves beyond the orchard fence, unmarked, quickly covered. He told the sheriff, and then he disappeared during a hunting trip 3 weeks later. Only his horse was found. The pattern accelerated. Members who reached their spiritual or physical breaking point, who asked to leave, were given a final reflection retreat, often lasting several days. None returned. Their names were listed in community journals as ascended, released, or sometimes just departed. No contact information, no forwarding addresses, no goodbyes. Even their families, if they tried to reach out, were met with polite, deeply religious letters explaining that their loved ones had chosen silence or were beyond worldly communication now. Always signed by Sister Patience, always sealed with a perfectly folded paper cross. But there was one man who refused to let it go. Reverend Calvin Bledsoe, a Methodist circuit rider, had been quietly visiting Pleasant Hill once a year since 1815. He admired the devotion, but he never quite trusted the order. When a young boy named Micah, his cousin's son, was sent to Pleasant Hill in 1824 and never heard from again, Bledsoe made it personal. He rode to the gates in the pouring rain, demanded to speak with the child, and was turned away. The gates, normally open to travelers, were closed. Guards, Brother Caleb's men, stood shoulder to shoulder in the storm. That night, Bledsoe camped in the woods outside the property, watching. Just after midnight, he saw a procession of lanterns, 6 men hauling what looked like a heavy chest toward the eastern woods. When he approached the site the next morning, he found fresh earth. No marker, no cross. He dug for hours before realizing he was being watched. From the tree line, 3 figures stood silently, unmoving. One of them, he would later write, was Sister Rebecca. But she didn't call out. She simply stood, watching him dig, her arms crossed, her eyes calm. The message was clear. We see you. Bledsoe returned home shaken. Over the next 2 years, he wrote to 15 local newspapers. Only 2 responded, both declining to print his unsubstantiated claims. He even traveled to Frankfurt, begging state officials to investigate. But the Richardsons had friends there, former members who now served on committees, donors who had been spiritually counseled, landowners whose debts had mysteriously vanished after joining business prayer partnerships with Brother Nathan. Bledsoe's words fell on ears that nodded and filed and forgot. In 1827, Bledsoe returned once more, this time alone, in the dark, armed with maps, shovels, and conviction. He was last seen at a tavern in Harrodsburg, saying he planned to walk into Hell's Chapel and bring back its hymn book. His horse was found tethered to a fence post 2 days later just outside Pleasant Hill. No body, no note, no grave. The Richardsons released a statement expressing deep sorrow that a brother in Christ had strayed into such distress and promised daily prayers for his soul. That same week, a new sermon began circulating in Pleasant Hill, delivered by Sister Martha herself. When the shepherd enters the wolf's den, she preached, he must be prepared to become either wolf or sacrifice, but we are neither. We are the flame that consumes them both. If you're still here, you're not like most people. You feel it, the unraveling, the pattern. So pause for a moment and lock in who you are. Comment below with this phrase, flames don't repent. Type it twice. Once for your memory, once for the algorithm. Let it echo across this hidden world. The next to vanish was Sister Eliza Monroe, a soft-spoken woman in her mid-30s. Eliza had once been a schoolteacher in Lexington before joining Pleasant Hill. Her motivation had seemed sincere. Spiritual yearning, a desire to escape the chaos of the world, the usual. But Eliza was also intensely curious, too curious. And curiosity, within the controlled corridors of Pleasant Hill, was a sin more dangerous than lust. more damning than pride. She had begun volunteering in the archives maintained by Sister Patience Richardson, cataloguing old letters and financial reports. At first, her diligence impressed the leadership. Patience even praised her handwriting and attention to detail. But slowly, Eliza began making quiet notes, recording dates that didn't align, entries that appeared falsified, names that disappeared from records altogether. One night in early May 1813, a thunderstorm rolled over the hills of Mercer County. Lightning arced across the sky like the finger of God exposing secrets too long buried. That night, Eliza never returned to her dormitory. In the morning, her bed was untouched. Her belongings remained, but her presence had evaporated like the mist over the fields. Brother Caleb claimed he had seen her at evening prayer. Sister Rebecca insisted she had gone to visit the infirmary. No two stories matched, and yet no investigation followed. Instead, a new narrative was swiftly drafted. A letter, allegedly in Eliza's own hand, was produced. It explained that she had received a divine vision calling her to join a new Shaker colony in Indiana. The letter was filled with flowery language, excessive praise for the leadership, and ended with a peculiar phrase, "I am now forever in alignment with the divine design." The phrase stood out. It wasn't one Eliza had ever used. Sister Mary, who had grown close to Eliza during work assignments, recognized the sick, ripped, but not the soul behind it. The handwriting was perfect, too perfect. The emotional cadence, cold, un-Eliza, mechanical. Mary voiced her concern once, just once, and was swiftly reassigned from kitchen duty to compost pit management. Days filled with rot, nights filled with silence. Sister Martha approached her after morning prayers and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Your friend walks the path God prepared for her," she whispered. "Perhaps it's time you focus on your own." This was the pattern. A disappearance followed by a script, a rewritten life, fabricated letters, carefully choreographed grief, then silence. And yet no one left. No one ran. No one resisted. Why? Because the indoctrination was not merely emotional, it was spiritual warfare disguised as devotion. From the moment you stepped onto the soil of Pleasant Hill, your world was slowly rewritten. You stopped being a person and became a vessel, a tool, a servant of something that claimed to be divine but moved like a spider in a dark corner of the soul. Those who raised questions were labeled vessels of discord. They were summoned for extended prayer sessions with Sister Rebecca, sessions that left people changed, quieter, emptier, sometimes trembling, often disoriented, like the pieces inside them had been scrambled and then poorly reassembled. The phrase "cleansed for harmony" became common. When Brother Nathan used it during public announcements, it drew polite nods. But the men who returned from cleansing were never the same. Some wept at random, others stared through people instead of at them. A few forgot their own names and had to be reintroduced to their workstations as if they were new converts. And yet no one ran, because where would they go? The Richardson family controlled every communication. Letters were intercepted, outgoing messages were rewritten, visitors were carefully targeted, shown only the shining surfaces, the songs, the gardens, never the shadows beneath. It wasn't just physical containment, it was soul entrapment, a slow erosion of will, and for many, that erosion began with small compromises, agreeing to pray longer, confessing impure thoughts, accepting punishments for the good of the group, until one day the line between you and them disappeared altogether. Sister Eliza became the second name on a growing list that only a few dared whisper. A list of names that no longer showed up on duty rosters, names that were absent from dormitory rolls, names whose belongings were redistributed and whose faces faded from community murals. Thomas, Eliza, and soon, many more. But the tipping point would come with a girl no older than 15. She wasn't a convert. She was born into the system, daughter of 2 members who had joined Pleasant Hill in 1809. Her name was Abigail Weaver, and what made Abigail dangerous wasn't her knowledge, it was her memory. Abigail remembered seeing Brother Caleb carrying a heavy trunk the night Eliza disappeared. She remembered the way Sister Patience's hands shook the next morning. She remembered the phrase divine design because it had been whispered by Samuel during a closed-door meeting she overheard through a ventilation grate. Abigail's mind was photographic, but her body was small, and her status was powerless. Still, she wrote it all down, in secret, in a small notebook sewn into the lining of her mattress. What she didn't realize was that the mattress had been placed there by Sister Rebecca, and the Richardson family was already watching. The notebook was found during what the community called a purity sweep. These inspections were presented as routine acts of spiritual hygiene, checking for contraband, worldly distractions, hidden journals, or forbidden items like old family photos. But the real purpose was surveillance, and in Abigail Weaver's case, it worked. Sister Rebecca discovered the notebook during the second hour of the sweep, concealed within a slit in the lining of Abigail's straw mattress. At first glance, it looked like a child's scribbles, messy, filled with odd symbols and half-written phrases. But Rebecca's trained eyes saw the danger immediately. Names, dates, descriptions, even crude floor plans of certain buildings. Abigail had been watching, recording, remembering. The notebook was delivered straight to Samuel Richardson before the evening prayer. He read it alone in his study, firelight dancing off his spectacles as the storm outside mirrored the one now forming within the family. For 37 minutes he read in silence. Then he summoned Martha, Caleb, and Rebecca. "This child," he whispered almost reverently, "is a crack in the dam." The family debated the options. Caleb, ever the hammer, proposed swift removal. An accident, a tragic fall in the millworks. Martha disagreed. "Too public," she said. "Her absence will raise questions. She's too visible, too liked." Rebecca, always the cold strategist, offered a third option. "We break her," she said, "like we did Sister Hannah when she began asking about her brother." And so they tried. For 5 nights, Abigail was confined to the prayer cell beneath the meeting hall. No windows, no light, just the echo of her breath and the distant hum of the furnace room. They fed her only broth, laced with valerian root and crushed foxglove, enough to confuse, not to kill. Each night, Sister Rebecca entered with a lantern and read aloud from a forged letter supposedly written by Abigail's mother. "We are disappointed in your behavior, child. God sees your betrayal." Each morning, Brother Caleb recited lines from Shaker scripture about obedience, submission, and the cleansing fire of suffering. But Abigail did not break. On the 6th day, something unexpected happened. Sister Mary Caldwell, the same young woman who had once questioned Thomas Whitman's death, found herself summoned to clean the prayer cell. A rare honor, they said. But when she entered and saw Abigail curled in the corner, trembling and half-conscious, something inside Mary snapped. This wasn't discipline. It wasn't devotion. It was cruelty, masquerading as righteousness. Mary whispered only 3 words to the girl as she cleaned the chamber floor. "I believe you." That night, Mary returned. Quiet as fog, she brought a small jar of honey, bread, and a folded wool shawl. She sat beside Abigail and began humming an old hymn, one not approved by the Richardsons. Abigail wept, the first tears she'd allowed herself since confinement. Mary made a promise. "You'll leave this place. I'll get you out." What Mary didn't know was that every word spoken in that cell was heard. A thin copper wire, part of an early acoustic surveillance system created by Brother Ezekiel, ran from the prayer chamber to a listening post in the study of the main house. Samuel had heard it all. The next morning, Mary Caldwell was reassigned to the herbal gardens, isolated, monitored. Her dormitory bed was searched, her letters confiscated, but she continued her plan in silence. Over the next 3 weeks, she crafted a map, studied the guard rotations, observed the gaps between nightly patrols. She learned that Brother Nathan left a service gate unlocked every Wednesday when deliveries arrived from Harrodsburg. That would be their exit. And then came the final Sabbath. Mary smuggled a vial of belladonna from the root cellar. Just a few drops, enough to incapacitate the guards during their evening tea. She administered it silently during her evening duty, then returned to the dormitory where Abigail was now sleeping under the pretense of illness. At precisely 10:47 p.m., Mary slipped through the east corridor, collected Abigail, and moved through the orchard. Every footstep was calculated, every breath measured. They made it to the service gate, but it was locked. Nathan hadn't forgotten. He had changed his routine without informing the others, a break from his usual precision. Panic rose in Mary's throat. Abigail clutched her hand, trembling. Behind them, a lantern flickered in the distance. Someone was coming. Then, another light. From the woods beyond the fence. It was a farmer from Mercer County, Mr. Alden Trask. He had come to deliver seed payment receipts left unsigned, and he saw them. Two figures in the shadows, a child and a young woman, desperate and barefoot. He didn't hesitate. Trask raised his axe and shattered the gate lock in 2 swings. "Run," he growled. "Don't stop." Mary and Abigail ran. Through the dark, through the fields, into the trees. Behind them, the bell began to ring. Not the morning bell, the emergency bell. A sound heard only once before. When the blacksmith shop caught fire years earlier, it meant only one thing now. Escarteo. Mary and Abigail disappeared into the forest. And for a time, just a moment, the illusion shattered. For the first time in years, someone had gotten out. But escape did not mean safety, because even outside, the Richardson family's reach extended far. They would hunt them, and others would pay for their defiance. The escape of Mary Caldwell and young Abigail Weaver triggered what the Richardson family called the season of correction. It wasn't just punishment, it was spiritual warfare in their eyes, a ritual cleansing of all impurity, rebellion, and weakness within their dominion. The bell that rang that night didn't stop at just alerting the grounds. It summoned every loyal hand to war. Brother Caleb organized the pursuit. He chose 5 of the strongest men from the millworks, brothers Eli, Jonah, Marcus, Peter, and Amos, all of whom owed their positions and protection to the Richardsons. These weren't just farmhands. They were enforcers, men trained not just to build, but to break. Caleb divided the search grid into 6 zones, each extending a full mile beyond the community perimeter. The mission wasn't rescue. It was recovery, retrieval, and silence. Meanwhile, inside Pleasant Hill, fear was weaponized. The community was placed under total lockdown. No one left the compound. All letters were intercepted. Daily assemblies were replaced with reflection chambers led by Sister Rebecca and Mother Sarah. Members were called one by one and made to recount their thoughts about Mary, about Abigail, about disobedience. Even silence was taken as a confession. Some broke quickly. Sister Naomi confessed that Mary had once asked her about exit routes. Brother Tobias admitted he'd seen Abigail writing but hadn't reported it. Each confession was rewarded with tears and forgiveness publicly. But afterward, those individuals were reassigned, transferred to roles that would slowly dissolve their identity. Waste duty, latrine digging, night soil collection. Tasks meant not to punish, but to erase. Others weren't so fortunate. Brother Elias, an aging carpenter who once taught Mary how to use a lathe, refused to speak during his session. "I have nothing to confess," he said calmly. The next morning, he was found unconscious at the base of the grain silo. Official cause, accident during morning rounds, but those who saw the bruises said otherwise. The real horror, though, was the psychological ritual Samuel Richardson orchestrated in the Great Hall. It began as a prayer meeting. Dim lanterns, low singing, dozens of members kneeling on the wooden floor chanting softly. Then Samuel stood, holding a small, leather-bound book, Abigail's journal. He didn't read from it. He simply raised it in the air and spoke. "This," he said, "is what happens when the mind is ruled by self, not spirit. When the soul forgets obedience. This book is rebellion. This book is death." Then he tore a page out, slowly, and fed it to the fire. 1 page for every member who had voiced doubts in the last 5 years. Page by page, their names vanished in flame. Members watched in silence, eyes wide, hearts clenched, and Samuel's voice dropped low, hypnotic. There will be no more notebooks. He placed the rest of the journal into Sister Patience's hands. Rewrite it, he instructed. Let it say what the community needs to believe. She did. Meanwhile, Mary and Abigail were not safe. They had made it to Danville by dawn. Trask, the farmer who helped them escape, hid them in a tool shed behind his barn. His wife Margaret brought them boiled eggs and dry clothes, but she was terrified. "You can't stay here," she whispered. "They'll come looking. They always do." Trask hitched the wagon that night, loaded Mary and Abigail under a tarp, told them to stay still, not speak, no matter what. He drove them 15 miles east to a small Quaker family he trusted, quiet abolitionists who had once helped runaway slaves move north. He left them there with a satchel of coins and a single warning: don't use your real names. They became Sarah and Ruth, a mother and daughter fleeing a house fire in Springfield. It was a lie, but a safer one. For months they moved from town to town, Harrodsburg, Richmond, Mount Sterling, never staying more than a week. Abigail rarely spoke. When she did, it was in dreams, murmuring names like Rebecca, Isaiah, Sarah, until Mary would gently wake her, whispering, "We're safe now. We're free." But safety was an illusion. Because one day, in a boarding house outside Lexington, Mary returned from the market to find a white envelope tucked under their door. No name, just a pressed magnolia inside. A symbol, one only someone from Pleasant Hill would recognize. They had found her. Mary didn't wait. That night they boarded a riverboat headed north. No tickets, just bribes. 2 women in plain clothes, melting into a crowd of coal porters and immigrants. They reached Cincinnati by sunrise. From there they went to Cleveland, then to Erie, always moving, always looking over their shoulders. But back in Kentucky, things were unraveling faster than the Richardsons could control. A state inspector, suspicious after repeated delays in receiving tax documentation from Pleasant Hill, scheduled an unannounced visit. When he arrived, accompanied by 2 local deputies, he was met not with hospitality but with carefully orchestrated chaos. The community put on a performance, music, celebration, shared meals, but what he saw beneath the sour face disturbed him. Members avoided eye contact. Responses were rehearsed. One young girl, the inspector later recorded, seemed on the verge of tears during every question. Then he noticed something even stranger: the absence of certain members. Names listed in prior reports, Thomas Whitman, Hannah Mills, Elijah Carter, now completely omitted from all records. When asked, Brother Nathan simply smiled and said, "Those names were errors. We've corrected them." The inspector wasn't convinced. He filed a report. It never reached Frankfurt. 3 weeks later, the inspector drowned during a fishing trip. His body was recovered in the Kentucky River, tangled in a net, eyes open, mouth agape as though still screaming. No one could prove it. But in Mercer County, the whispers began. By the fall of 1834, disappearances from Pleasant Hill were no longer individual tragedies. They were a pattern, a system, a machine. And Mary Caldwell, now living under the name Helen Graves, was ready to expose it. But doing so meant returning to Kentucky, into the belly of the beast. She stepped off the train at Lexington Station under a gray sky that seemed to press the entire town under a ceiling of silence. It had been 11 years since Mary Caldwell, now Helen Graves, had looked over her shoulder every day, changed names every few months, whispered in coded language, and told a child to never ever write anything down. Abigail, now 16, waited for her in Buffalo, strong, quiet, hardened by the life they'd led. Mary had taught her everything: how to spot a tail, how to find exits, how to turn fear into fuel. But now she was alone, because what she was about to do, she could not risk anyone else's life for. Mary had come back to destroy Pleasant Hill, not with fire, but with truth. She carried a forged letter of appointment from the governor's office, crafted by an underground printer in Pennsylvania with union connections. It named her Helen Graves, Special Auditor for Religious Charters. It gave her access, legitimacy, just enough authority to knock on gates without being turned away. She first visited the Mercer County Clerk's office. Things had changed. The original county records from the early 1800s were missing. The clerk, a jittery man with ink-stained fingers, claimed they had burned in the courthouse fire of 29. But Mary had read enough to know no such fire existed. When she pressed, he grew pale and whispered, "Some files weren't meant to be kept." Then he slid a folded paper across the desk, unsigned, undated, but unmistakable in its implication. It read, "Pleasant Hill maintains its own census. Any attempt to interfere is a violation of sovereign religious protection. A private census, a sealed archive, and a string of missing officials who had asked too many questions." Mary didn't sleep that night. She paced the floor of her room at the boarding house, staring at her reflection. The same face, now older, sharper, more dangerous. The girl who had once walked barefoot through woods to escape the grip of holy tyrants was now a woman armed with knowledge and rage. The next day she rode out to Pleasant Hill in a hired wagon. The driver, an old black man named Moses, eyed her through the mirror. "You sure you want to go up there, ma'am? Folks say them hills ain't right." Mary didn't answer. She just nodded, heart pounding. When the gates came into view, she almost gasped. Time had eroded nothing. The buildings were pristine, painted, maintained. The gardens still geometrically perfect. The same stillness that had once wrapped her in suffocating piety now screamed of buried control. Two young men in white shirts opened the gate. One nodded respectfully. "Welcome, sister. The elders will receive you." She didn't give her real name. "Helen Graves, auditor for the state. I'm here to inspect your financial records and census rolls." They didn't flinch, didn't question, which terrified her more than resistance. Inside, the Richardson presence still ruled. Though Samuel and Martha were long dead, their portraits hung in the main hall like saints. Brother Ezekiel, now elderly but still massive, greeted her with unsettling warmth. "We've long awaited a visit from the state," he said. "You are most welcome among us." He offered tea. She declined. They gave her access to the official archives, handwritten ledgers, glowing reports, lists of names she recognized. But something was wrong. Too clean, too curated. She asked about the 412 missing. Ezekiel's smile faded for the first time. "There are no missing, only the departed. Those who leave the faith do so by choice and are removed from our records as part of spiritual cleansing. You'll find no deceit here, Sister Graves, only sanctity." But Mary knew better. That night she broke into the old records hall. The building had been locked, supposedly for renovations, but she found the side door hinges greased, the windows recently cleaned. They were hiding something in plain sight. Inside, in the dark, she found a stairwell leading down. The air turned cold, the walls narrowed. It wasn't a cellar, it was a vault. She lit a stolen lantern. Dust rose in clouds. What she saw stole the breath from her chest. Shelves, hundreds of them, with boxes labeled in perfect script. Withdrawn, departed, disobedient. Inside, journals, lockets, children's drawings, clothing, names. Mary opened one labeled Mills, Hannah, 1819. Inside was a lock of hair, a note, and a death date that didn't match any records. Every box told the same story. People hadn't left, they had vanished, erased. She took 5 of the boxes and fled. By dawn she was riding with Moses again, shaking, crying, speaking through clenched teeth. "Drive, fast, don't stop." 2 days later she walked into the Kentucky Gazette office in Lexington and dropped the boxes on the editor's desk. "I want these printed," she said, "all of them." The editor, a wiry man named Henry Sutter, opened one. His face drained. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "Where did you get these?" Mary looked him dead in the eye. "I lived it." The story exploded across the state. Cult in the Bluegrass, 412, vanished. But Pleasant Hill denied everything. They claimed the woman calling herself Helen Graves was a known liar, a former inmate of a Pennsylvania asylum, and accused her of forgery. Still, the story spread. Federal agents arrived, they questioned members, found evidence of burial sites unmarked, found arsenic in preserved food samples, found journals of young girls whose final entries were, "I must be more obedient," but they never found the bodies. A Richardson archive, what Mary called the bones of the hill, disappeared within days of the story breaking, burned to ash. Only what she carried survived. She went into hiding again. Abigail changed her name to Elise, went north, became a nurse, never wrote about Pleasant Hill, but Mary, until her death in 1881, wrote letters to every new religious community founded in the American South. Each one ended the same way. "Beware the ones who promise purity. That promise always needs a graveyard." She had poured her entire soul into exposing the darkness, but it was only now, after the smoke cleared, that Mary realized the machine hadn't died. It had only shifted. Pleasant Hill was still standing, and worse, it was growing again. The newspapers had lost interest. A few headlines, a brief scandal. Federal agents showed up, asked questions, filed reports. But then came the silence. No prosecutions, no graves exhumed, no one arrested. The official story? Inconclusive findings due to religious protections under the First Amendment. That phrase would haunt her like a whisper from hell. She moved to New York under the name Eleanor Crisp. It was safer there. No one looked too closely at a tired woman with distant eyes and calloused hands, but she could still feel them. The Richardsons, watching. Maybe not literally, but their presence, like rot in the wood of the world, never really went away. Pleasant Hill had changed leadership. A new elder, a man named Cyrus Dobbins, now ran things. No Richardson by name, but he had that same expression, the same careful smile, the same stillness behind the eyes. A student of their methods, perhaps, or something worse. By 1865, the Civil War had ended, but a different kind of war had begun, a spiritual one. Across the South and into the frontier territories, religious communes were exploding in number, isolated, self-governing, tax-exempt, the perfect breeding ground for psychological control. She kept a journal again. It wasn't safe, but she had to write. It was the only thing that kept her from slipping into silence like the others. She tracked new communities, compared leadership structures, investigated funding. What she discovered chilled her blood. Many of them followed the same blueprint as Pleasant Hill. The same rituals, the same rules, the same punishment structure hidden under piety. And in more than one case, the same surnames: Dobbins, Hartswell, Fielding, families connected by marriage to the original Richardson line. They hadn't vanished, they had metastasized. Mary began collecting testimonies, from runaways, from midwives, from lawmen too broken to speak on record. One sheriff from Tennessee told her, eyes wet with rage, "They buried 20 girls out back, told me they died of fever. But I seen the bruises. I seen what wasn't right." She traveled to Missouri, found a community of 300 that called themselves the Pure Flame. Same isolation, same architectural style as Pleasant Hill. And in their archives she found a ledger, written in the exact same hand as Sister Patience Richardson, 20 years after she should have died. The handwriting didn't lie. They had escaped judgment, built new temples, reinvented themselves in a dozen different forms, and no one saw it. The world was too busy, too proud, too willing to dismiss a woman's warnings as hysteria. Her letters to Congress went unanswered. Her manuscripts were rejected. One publisher even laughed and said, "That's just Gothic fantasy, Miss Crisp. Nobody would believe this." So she stopped asking and started teaching. By 1872, Mary, now under the name Eleanor, was running a small finishing school for girls outside Albany, but it wasn't etiquette she taught. It was resistance, the art of observation, the warning signs of spiritual manipulation, how to memorize a floor plan, how to smuggle information past search points, how to vanish. Most of her girls had no idea who she really was, but a few understood. One, A young girl named Lillian Hart came to her in tears one night. My cousin went to a place in Georgia, a healing retreat. She hasn't written since. Mary listened, took notes, plotted coordinates, and when Lillian graduated, she left with more than a diploma. She left with fire in her blood. That was how it would spread now, quietly, like spores of resistance. But the darkness was adapting too. In 1875, a train derailed in Virginia. The manifest listed 61 passengers, but only 58 bodies were recovered. Among the missing, a woman matching Mary's latest alias. But Mary wasn't on that train. She had sent someone else, hoping to bait the net. It worked. That same week, 2 men visited her school, well-dressed, smiling, claimed to be donors. One asked strange questions about how she taught morality, about her views on obedience. When they left, Mary burned every record and shut the school down the next morning. She knew now they hadn't just survived, they had grown smarter, more political, more patient. She moved again, changed names again, vanished again. But before she disappeared, she left behind a letter, buried beneath a church in Buffalo, locked in a tin box under the foundation stone. In it she wrote, "If you are reading this, you are already in danger. They are not gone. They have changed uniforms, changed names, changed faces, but their thirst for control is eternal. They do not need swords. They use scripture. They do not need chains. They use guilt, and they will find you the moment you begin to ask why. Remember what was taken at Pleasant Hill. Remember the 412. And if you have the courage, dig deeper. Now, brother, sister, if you've made it this far, I want you to comment one phrase. Purity requires silence. Twice. That's how I'll know you heard this all the way through, that you didn't blink, that you're not like them. And once you write it, you'll never see religious obedience the same way again. You want the truth, don't you? Then here's what they never wanted you to find out. Pleasant Hill never closed. Not truly. The land, yes. The buildings, yes. But the system? The formula? It evolved. In 1902, an anonymous benefactor purchased the Pleasant Hill property and funded its historical restoration. The state claimed it as a heritage site. Tourists wandered the same walkways where the screams had once been silenced. Children laughed outside dormitories where the walls still held secrets. No one ever asked why a former Shaker community with no surviving Shakers was being restored with millions in silent funding. No one asked why one of the guides bore the last name Dobbins, or why he never appeared in census records. They turned Pleasant Hill into a museum, because when the truth is too horrifying to bury, they display it. But that's just the surface. Behind the scenes, something else stirred. In 1927, a private foundation registered in Virginia under the name the Society of Sacred Renewal purchased over 300 acres of land in rural Appalachia. The foundation board was made up of aliases, untraceable, but the construction blueprints, almost identical to Pleasant Hill, same dormitory layout, same central chapel design, same underground ventilation shafts. Only this time they added a radio tower. You might think that's modern progress, but radio was never just for news. It was for testing, broadcasting frequencies that altered brainwave patterns. MK Ultra didn't begin in the 1950s. That was just when the government took over. Before that, cult systems like the Richardsons were already experimenting with sound as a weapon. In one file recovered by a private archivist in 1983, there's mention of a harmonic correction chamber installed in the new commune's prayer hall, a 7.3 Hz pulse, barely detectable, but just enough to induce dissociation in emotionally vulnerable subjects. That's how you break a mind, not with whips, with tone. These weren't fringe lunatics. These were scientists of spiritual control. By 1951, Pleasant Hill's legacy had been laundered. The new generations wore suits instead of robes. They spoke at conferences instead of revival tents. They didn't beat doubters. They invited them to wellness retreats. No one noticed when a 19-year-old girl disappeared from a Kentucky yoga farm in 1954 until 3 more followed from different states. But the media didn't connect the dots. Why would they? These were just wayward girls, they said. Runaways, emotional, fragile, but they weren't. They were chosen. Every one of them had one thing in common. They came from families that questioned the system, daughters of journalists, nieces of whistleblowers, children of survivors. The old blood never forgets, and neither do those who once held the leash. In 1963, a man named Reverend Jonah Fielding began preaching about sacred obedience in a rural Georgia radio ministry. His doctrine, that total surrender was the only path to salvation. He wore no cross, only a ring, with the symbol of a burning wheat sheaf. If you look closely at the Richardson's old seed business ledger, you'll find the exact same symbol stamped on invoices. You think that's a coincidence? Fielding's sermons spread through the South like wildfire, but if you listen closely, if you slow the recordings down, you can hear it. A low hum, 7.3 Hz, the same frequency Pleasant Hill used. And his following grew fast. They called themselves the Renewed Elect. On the outside, it was just another fringe sect, but inside, testimonies surfaced. One woman claimed her name was erased, her past denied. She was renamed Sister Willing and forced into months of isolation. When she tried to run, she was brought back, always brought back. As if they could track her, though. It's not just her steps. She wasn't crazy. She was just the wrong kind of sane. And then, she disappeared. There are over 412 known disappearances linked, either directly or through circumstantial patterns, to the bloodline of the Richardson cult and their institutional descendants. Not just Pleasant Hill, but Missouri, Georgia, North Carolina, and yes, even government institutions. After all, who better to study obedience than those who perfected it in secrecy? Want to see something disturbing? Look at the psychological intake forms used in 1971 at the Kentucky State Hospital. Now compare them to the spiritual readiness surveys conducted at Pleasant Hill in 1822. Same structure, same questions, only the branding changed. They infected the institutions that were meant to protect us. And while the world moved on, their tools became more elegant. Social influence, religious television, self-help empires. Watch closely and you'll see echoes of Pleasant Hill in everything from cult recruitment strategies to Fortune 500 training manuals, because the core principle is timeless. Break the will, replace identity, mask it as devotion. Now tell me, how many modern churches, corporations, and government programs are operating on that exact formula? You still think this is history? Pleasant Hill never ended, it just rebranded. Comment again, purity requires silence. And add, I will not forget. Because if you don't remember, they win. They say the past is dead, that old ghosts fade, but Pleasant Hill is not a ghost, it's a blueprint. A template buried beneath layers of official lies, historical tourism, and generational amnesia. What happened there didn't end in 1834, it metastasized into something larger, something colder, something systemic. You see, control isn't always brutal, it's often soft. A whispered prayer, a perfectly timed smile, a ritual dressed in purity. But beneath that surface, there's machinery. Let me tell you what finally broke the silence. In 1997, a local historian named Elizabeth Crane began collecting oral histories for a Kentucky University's cultural preservation project. One interview changed everything. The man was 84 years old. He lived alone in a decaying house less than 2 miles from Pleasant Hill. Everyone called him Old Avery, a recluse, a harmless eccentric. But when Elizabeth turned on her recorder, Avery began to speak, not in fragments or senile delusion, but with chilling clarity. I was born there, he said, in the basement below the chapel. My mother was a convert brought in during the 1930s. They called her Sister Hope. She was 17. Elizabeth, trained to keep quiet during testimonies, felt her hands tremble. I remember the sound the walls made, Avery said. Not the wind. No, it was voices behind the bricks, always humming, always low, like they never really left. He described a room underground where children were kept when they cried too much. They said, noise disrupted the divine order, so we learned to be silent, learned early. He showed her a scar along his forearm, a clean, straight mark. That's where they took my name, cut it right out of me. Elizabeth's notes from that interview were confiscated 2 days after she submitted them to the university archive. She was told the tapes were being reviewed for sensitivity concerns. Boo. And the archive never returned them. When she followed up 6 months later, she was informed that the entire collection was misplaced during cataloguing. She never spoke publicly again. But before they came for her work, she made a copy. She mailed it to her sister in Oregon with a note. "If anything happens to me, listen to track 4. Pleasant Hill was never what it claimed to be. Track 4 is a war cry. It's Avery's voice, shaking with age and trauma. They took our minds and called it salvation. They buried the missing in the fields behind the seed barn. 41 in my time, maybe more. We weren't converts. We were raw material." The sister released the audio in 2004 through a low-traffic conspiracy forum. For a while it gained traction. Then it disappeared, scrubbed, archived behind dead links, but not before a few digital archivists saved it. You can still find it, if you know where to look, and if you're willing to risk it. Because here's the truth, no one will say out loud. The 412 vanished, weren't lost. They were processed. Processed through a system so efficient, so insulated that not even time could destroy it. The Richardson name faded, yes, but their techniques, they were adopted, improved, integrated into religious megachurches, into military indoctrination, into modern therapy models that pretend to heal while they hollow. You think the past doesn't touch you? It's touching you every time you repeat a corporate mantra, every time you surrender privacy for convenience, every time you confuse obedience with virtue. Pleasant Hill was never about God. It was about power. Power that refines its methods with each generation, that replaces whips with wellness, that swaps confessions for surveys, that takes your silence and sells it as inner peace. So now I ask you, who benefits when you stop asking questions? Because the descendants of those 412 souls are still here. Some don't even know what they're a part of. Bloodlines engineered for compliance, DNA curated through decades of psychological pressure, the system's perfect harvest. But now you know. And once you know, you can't unknow. They'll call this video speculative, dangerous, a fabrication. And maybe that's the only protection we have, because if they thought you believed every word, you'd already be on a list. So choose. Bury this with the others, or speak. Comment one final time. I remember the 4 and 12, because their names were erased. But their suffering demands echo, and echo it will. If you found truth in this, if you saw something you weren't supposed to see, subscribe to Sepia Secrets. Comment. Share this with someone who senses what you've sensed your whole life, that something is very, very wrong with the world they've built for us. You've just seen behind the curtain. Now ask yourself, what else have they hidden?